Do you know, it's hard for me to believe, but there was a time in my life when wonderful historical exhibits such as we are seeing tonight and the program that we are enjoying tonight meant absolutely nothing to me. All those precious pictures and clippings, many of them from the Rustler, and mementos that my mother had saved so diligently, to me were just a bunch of junk. Who cares, I thought? Who cares about the history of ordinary people like us? We're not important. By the time I woke up to the fact of how precious our family heritage really is, it was almost too late. All of my old-timers were gone, and it was quite a shock to me to realize that I was now a member of the older generation, and that was some time ago. So, using my mother's collection as a base, I started to reach out to family members, and I discovered some I didn't even know existed. To historical societies, to libraries, I followed every clue, and it has been a very rewarding experience for me. And the best part of all has been the sharing. With that thought in mind, I would like to share with you just a bit of my family research by telling you the story of a tiny little lady who lived out in Bitterwater. Her name was Maria Guadalupe Quintanar Tully, and she was born way down in Old Mexico in a town called Chihuahua. When Maria was just blossoming into womanhood, a handsome young Irishman named Edward Chapin Tully drove a prairie schooner hitched to a 6-yoke team of Missouri oxen all the way from Independence, Missouri to Chihuahua and went into merchandising. Well, Edward and Maria fell madly in love, and they were the first couple to be married in the Catedral de Chihuahua in 1849. Their first 3 children, Louis, Edward, and Frank, were all born in Chihuahua, Mexico. In 1853, an event occurred that was to drastically change their whole lives. A Mr. White approached D.C. Tully and said, "Mr. Tully, I am looking for someone who speaks Spanish and English fluently to help drive a band of sheep from Mexico to California. If you will join us, you will receive a 1/3 share of the sheep plus a share of the net profits, and I will look after your family in your absence." And so it was that the founding father of our Bitterwater Tullys came to California in 1854, not in quest of gold, but rather trailing along in the dust of a huge band of sheep all the way from Sonora, Mexico to Los Angeles, where the sheep were divided, and he took his share and drove them on foot with the help of a few Indian herders up the coast through the Salinas Valley to the Bay Area, where he leased land from the missions to pasture them. In the meantime, little Maria had not been idle. She was only about 20 when she enlisted the aid of her brother, Francisco Quintanar de Alvarez, who was 2 years younger than she, and they put as many of her belongings as possible onto pack animals. And with her 3 infant sons, one just a little toddler, they went on horseback all the way across Mexico, through the rugged mountains and hostile Indian country, to the west coast of Mexico, where they boarded a little steamship, the Coloma, and sailed to the San Francisco Bay, where Edward met them and took them to Gilroy, where he had established a home for them. And searching for more pasture for the sheep, E.C. Tully and his brother-in-law, Frank Alvarez, ran across a narrow little valley just east of here. Upon dismounting and scooping up a bit of the water out of the stream, they exclaimed, "Agua amarga." Do any of you know what that means? Bitter water. Right. And that's what they call that valley. And this was wild, uninhabited government land with abundant feed. So after finding a sweet water spring in the center of the valley, Edward Tully constructed a 2-story adobe near the spring and moved his family to Bitterwater in 1862. After coming to California, Maria bore her beloved Eduardo 8 more children, 6 more boys, and finally 2 little girls, making 11 children in all. It is a good thing she had a large family to care for, as they were really isolated. No neighbors for miles and miles. The nearest settlement of any size was Gilroy, 65 miles away, where they went 2 or 3 times a year for their mail and supplies. I don't even like Sundays because there's no mail. In the 1870s, there was a land hunger, and Bitterwater Valley filled to the brim with settlers. And that is when Maria had her name changed. The settlers changed her middle name, Guadalupe, to Lupe. And Lupe Tully it remained for all the rest of her days, and it fitted her because she was so tiny. As with most pioneers, the Tullys had their share of tragedy. In 1868, they lost their younger daughter, little Sarah Elizabeth Tully, when she was just over a year old. 2 years later, they lost the older daughter, Lucretia, and her brother, little General Lee Tully, on the same day from scarlet fever. She was only 7 and he was almost 5. Then 3 years later, in 1873, they lost a 4th child, their 8th son, little George, who was only 3 1/2. And that wasn't all. They had one more very bitter tragedy to surmount. Lupe's sister-in-law, her brother Frank de Alvarez's wife, became so despondent with the constant childbearing, the drudgery of preparing meals for all those sheep herders, and the primitive conditions under which they lived, she just could not tolerate pioneer life any longer. In desperation, she committed suicide and was one of the first to be buried in the little cemetery out in Bitterwater. But Lupe and Ed Tully overcame their difficulties in the true pioneer spirit and lived to see their 7 remaining sons grow to manhood and have families of their own, all except Calhoun, who was crippled and he had never married. But he lived to be 88. Edward Chapman Tully died in 1907 at the age of 81. Little Lupe lived until 1915, when she too died at 81. They're both buried here in the King City Cemetery. Thank you so much for sharing the story of my tiny little grandmother, little Lupe Tully, this pint-sized pioneer of Bitterwater.